We're joined by Helena Ivanov. Is that right? Ivanov?
Correct.
Once again, I'm from Alabama. I like to use that as a throwaway for everything I do wrong in life, which is a lot, sadly. Anyway, so Helena, thanks for being with us. Helena is with the Henry Jackson Society. Is that correct?
Correct.
I don't have my notes in front of me, so I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So today, we're going to talk about, so th how do I explain this? We're going to talk about propaganda and violence and what is the nexus between the two. Now, in a global context. So I know you've written a lot about that. You understand that. So kind of walk us through what is the baseline, if we're having this conversation for the audience to understand, if we talk about propaganda and violence and the nexus, help us walk through that.
Well, to give context, like my PhD basically covered the topic of the relationship between propaganda and violence. It focused specifically on the former Yugoslav case since I'm based in Belgrade, Serbia. But I think that the kinds of stuff that I'm going to talk about today are sort of applicable across cases and not just applicable to the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Well, I think, the starting point is basically to say that most don't think that violence is legitimate. Like most people, if you walk around the street and you ask them, do you think it's okay if you just take your knife and stab a person here or shoot a person there? They're going to say no, right? But if that is the case on one hand, then obviously there's a second question. Well, if people think that violence is illegitimate, how come we have so much violence across the globe, politically motivated violence and other kinds of violence as well? And I think specifically talking about political violence, this is where propaganda steps in. Propaganda is the process which basically convinces people that what they originally thought was illegitimate is in fact legitimate. At the extreme, some people will be convinced through propaganda that they should engage in violence themselves. At somewhat less extreme level, a lot of people will not necessarily engage in violence, but propaganda will persuade them that the violence committed in their name or violence committed by their state or violence committed by a specific terrorist organization is in fact legitimate. And that, I think, is the sort of one-line summary of what is the role that propaganda plays in violence. It twists violence from something generally perceived as illegitimate into something that is perceived as legitimate and sometimes even necessary.
Well, let's go back to the basis, the definition of propaganda. I mean, so, is propaganda automatically bad? Is there such thing as good propaganda, or is it all bad propaganda?
That is a very, very interesting question. And I think, over the last many decades, the term propaganda is generally always associated with something negative. It is a huge debate between scholars and general audiences as well. For me specifically, I don't think that the term itself needs to carry positive or negative connotation. I think that the distinguishing things about propaganda is that there is an intent to direct and shape other people's behavior. And you do that through words, videos, and any other available communication. Those, I think, are the two distinct attributes of propaganda. Now, are you going to use that for good purposes? And for example, propagate that people should be more environmentally conscious, or that people should be more empathetic, or that people who are extremely rich should donate more, etc. Or are you going to use that to portray illegitimate violence as legitimate and necessary? Well, that's up to you, I would say. So I personally don't think that it is necessary for us to automatically assume propaganda to be something bad. I think the key thing is to focus on that intent to change someone's behavior through verbal and nonverbal communication.
Yeah, because you look at once again, being an American, the American Revolution, you could argue, was the propaganda of the colonists incited the American Revolution to break away from the UK, right? So there was
Yes.
that. And I would argue that was good propaganda because we needed to leave the UK, even though you and I are both in the UK these days. But then you can look at bad propaganda. I don't know. You look at the January 6th rioters. Some people would argue that was bad propaganda because people would argue that in the United States that, hey, you were doing a common goal because Donald Trump and about the election, and so take action there. So it's just, to me, it's just one of my little personal things I think about propaganda. And then, is it good or bad? Because of the intent. If I'm educating people or providing information with an expected outcome, then, that could be good. For example, in elections, let's go back to Serbia right now. I mean, I want to try to take this in the direction of Serbia and Kosovo, right? So
Mhm.
you have that conflict between Serbia and Kosovo, which is ongoing now. And in Serbia, I'm sure that the propaganda is that Kosovo is, should be part of Serbia and should not be independent. I mean, do you see how is the propaganda playing there in that regard? You know.
Well, this is obviously a decades, if not in some cases centuries, long question, and propaganda has evolved in a lot of different ways. One thing to note, obviously, is that even though the situation on the ground is like really, really, really difficult, and I think that a functional solution and the so-called normalization of relations between Serbia and Kosovo is unfortunately nowhere near in sight. The situation in the region is far better than it was, say, towards the end of the 90s. Of course, there are many rounds of escalations and violence happens here and there, but Serbia and Kosovo are not really in like a state of war, which I think, is a huge advantage. Ultimately, I think the huge problem is that, Kosovo and Serbia are two, countries with completely mutually exclusive political aims. Kosovo wants full sovereignty and complete independence. Serbia refuses to give an inch on this, saying that Kosovo is the heartland of Serbia, which is like a very common saying here. That is sort of the starting point. But then going down the line, the problem is that governments and regimes and political parties on both sides, to an equal extent, have been more than willing to utilize propaganda to promote certain narratives and tropes and nationalistic attitudes, which have really made lives of people in Kosovo incredibly difficult. And when I say people in Kosovo, I mean of both ethnicities. To be a Serb living in the north or in the south of Kosovo is really not an easy thing. A lot of those Serbs are very afraid of Kurti's regime. They do not feel safe. A lot of unilateral moves made by the Kurti government lately have, given grounds to these fears. On the other hand, a lot of people in north of Serbia feel very much abandoned. In the north of Kosovo, who are of Serb ethnicity, feel very much abandoned by the Belgrade regime. They feel that the Belgrade regime utilizes them to promote nationalistic agenda when that suits their interest, but then ignores the real requests that these people have. So I think, propaganda has, in this case, really contributed to huge polarization between the peoples. It made peaceful coexistence really, really difficult. And I'm not sure whether it actually protected the interests of those whose interests all had to be protected by their respective governments and political representatives, if that makes sense.
Well, just real quick, just so the audience understands the Henry Jackson Society, what do they do, and tell us a little about them.
So Henry Jackson Society is a London-based think tank that conducts research, writes reports, and promotes various policies that focus on advancing freedoms and protecting human rights and protecting democracy. So that's what we do. We do it from all different sorts of angles. We focus on all different sorts of regions, but freedom, human rights, and democracy are sort of three key principles that we try and advance and protect in all different sets of circumstances that we look at and analyze.
Well, the three things I believe the most in, so it's great. I'm glad to have you here. So let's talk about propaganda in Russia. To me, they're kind of the masters of propaganda, I would say, and that's when I would say more on the negative side. So how does Russia play into propaganda these days? Is it a very important tool for them globally?
Oh, I think it is absolutely crucial tool for them globally. And I think, they do it pretty well. I think one thing that they do is that they obviously have various disinformation tactics that they use. They're very flexible and adaptable in a sense that I think, as part of the sanctions package, a lot of Russian media outlets have been banned across the world, which obviously limited the amount of propaganda that Russia can disseminate. However, I think that they've been very able to utilize social media platforms, and specifically Telegram and similar channels, to nevertheless still maintain media presence across the countries where their official media outlets have been banned. I think what is also very interesting about Russian propaganda, and I think this is often missed in the scholarship and the study and sort of general discussions about Russian propaganda, is that Russian propaganda is very adaptable to the country's specific circumstances. So I think, for example, if you are based and you live in Serbia, which, by the way, hasn't imposed sanctions on Russia and subsequently still also, has Russia Today and Sputnik available to general audiences, I think propaganda that Russia disseminates in a country like Serbia is going to be quite different to propaganda that Russia disseminates in a country like Georgia, is going to be quite different than propaganda disseminated in the UK. So I think, one of the reasons why Russian propaganda is so often successful is because it is very context specific and usually adapted to the specific audiences. So it's not always the same. Obviously, certain narratives and certain tropes are going to be the same, But I think the way in which they play out in specific context is what differs and what ultimately makes it successful.
Yeah, I mean that's I do a lot of political work, and what's critical is like like even if you look at the United States and presidential campaigns. I mean, you may have a national messaging, but then you have to localize and focus your messaging to because one thing happening in Alabama is different than what's happening in California versus New
Exactly.
York versus Wyoming. So you have to localize that, and I agree. I think that Russia they are masters at it, and they know how to deal with Georgia. They know how to deal with Moldova. They know how to deal. I mean, look at what's happening in the eastern part of Ukraine. Definitely. So I'm gonna since the show is based in Africa, I do want to ask you kind of a question about Africa. I mean, propaganda in Africa. I mean, you look at Russia. You've had 5 coups within Africa. There's no doubt that those coups have been successful because of the propaganda. And so, does propaganda like almost always end up in a violence context, or do you think that that if we think about specific coups in West Africa and the propaganda that I know Russia was behind, do you think promoting violence is the goal?
So I wouldn't want to portray myself as an expert in African coups. So like obviously,
Come
I'm
on, you
my
know everything. Come on.
my knowledge and expertise here is limited. But I do think that whenever we have violence, whenever we have war, whenever we have a conflict, propaganda will always be present. I don't think that we can have a coup or a violent exchange on a political level, that isn't at least in part driven by propaganda or promoted, by propaganda, if you see what I mean.
And do you think propaganda, well, listen, I think governments probably have a greater ability to use propaganda because of the tools available to them. And do you see, like, let's go back to Serbia, for example. I mean, the propaganda that you see in that country, is it more driven by the government or is it driven grassroots? And also, what tools are typically used in propaganda?
Well, in the Serbian case, the just as we speak, huge protests are happening across Serbia. They were triggered by a train station tragedy that happened on November 1st when a canopy collapsed and killed 15 people. The people who are currently protesting allege that part of the reason why that canopy fell is because the government entered multiple corrupt deals, hasn't ensured that the canopy was renovated properly when the whole station was renovated. That has sort of then spiraled into, student blockages. So the universities across Serbia are blocked. Many high schools are also blocked. There's a huge conversation as to whether all teachers are going to enter a general strike. So, like, the situation in the country is really, really complicated. But one of the things that has been an omnipresent problem in Serbia and is now also particularly highlighted in the context of these protests is the media freedoms and the fact that, channels with national outreach have been basically under control by the government, that the media landscape is not diverse at all, with the exception of like 2 TV channels that are only localized and a few print media. Most other media outlets that you can have access to are basically controlled by the government or very much government aligned. Um, so yeah, in the Serbian context, this is a huge problem. The government usually relies, on traditional media outlets, so TV, print, online web pages of mainstream media. But increasingly, you can also see that social media platforms are being utilized. So, for example, ever since these protests have began, President Vučić has basically been addressing the nation on a daily basis. He's often using his Instagram platform to do that. You can also see that a lot of Serbian Progressive Party's politicians, which is a ruling party in Serbia, have also been, addressing people on Twitter. So I think increasingly the government is also utilizing the social media platforms. But I think this also stands true, for anyone who wants to propagate anything. As Elon Musk has said, you are the media now. And I think in a way, with this rise of social media platforms that's been going on for decades right now, propagandists have been increasingly turning away from mainstream media outlets to social media platforms or adding social media platforms to the pool of tools that they use to disseminate their propaganda.
Because we only have a minute left, but I got a quick question because Facebook, ever since Trump has come in, I mean, Facebook has decided to pull back their fact checkers, basically to limit their fact checkers. What role do you think social media or what responsibility do you think social media has in checking tracking stuff? Do you think that it should be more checks, less checks? It should be just freedom of speech? I mean, where do you come down on that?
I think this is one of the most difficult questions of the 21st century because I think, one could argue that what Facebook did in the past, like just before Trump won the elections, was too much on the restrictive side. I think, when you start limiting the topics that we can talk about and that we can debate, you will inevitably run into a problem of becoming very arbitrary and quite likely limiting freedom of speech just a little bit too much. At the same time, if you go on the other side of that extreme and you just allow everybody to say whatever they want, especially on platforms like Facebook or Twitter, which have huge outreach and can have a huge impact, you also then run into a problem because with uninformed or misinformed public, you can do whatever you want. Evidence that incitement is a real thing and that people can see things online and engage in violence is also real. So I think they have a responsibility to figure that balance out. I'm not saying that it's an easy job, but if you are a billionaire, if you run one of the largest companies in the world that has such a substantial impact on global scale, I think it is your duty to constantly work on figuring out how to strike that balance right. And that's what I think they should do. How to strike it is, I think, longer than 1 minute conversation.
Well, yeah, listen, I've been trying to figure that out myself and I have no idea. Listen, I really, truly appreciate, Helena, you being on the show today. Sadly, we're out of time. But I will definitely have you back. I'd love to have you back to talk
My
about this
pleasure.
more.
Anytime.
Well,
Thank you
thanks
so
again
much.
thank you for joining Dane Waters on Around the World with Dane Waters, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you very much.